The scriptures we're going to be reflecting on today are the gospel lesson that you find in your service folder. If you would like to open your service folder and follow along, it's from Matthew chapter 11. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples. And he said to them, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." And as they went their way, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. "What did you go out to the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, 'Behold, I will send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I say to you, among those born of women there has arisen none greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." This is the word of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Lord.
Would you join me in prayer? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. It's 10 days till Christmas. It's coming up fast. Soon all the lights and the carols, the presents will be past. So Matthew's gospel is written us to prepare, lest we miss Christmas meaning. So take watch and beware. It's easy to get caught up in all the holiday bliss and let Christmas go by, its meaning to miss. That passage from Matthew centers on Christ and his glory. But it doesn't take place until 30 years after the Christmas story? Why am I rhyming them? This isn't even a Christmas story, Matthew chapter 11. I mean, rhyming has come to what we've come to expect from a good Christmas story, isn't it? We expect it to be all wrapped up in a nice little rhyme where each line ends neat and tidy, not a syllable out of place. Whether it's "'Twas the night before Christmas," or even "Away in a manger," which has long since been turned from a poem and set to tune, so we sing it as a carol. But in all of them, we expect that each line will wrap up its nice little Christmas theme, and every line will come out right. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. But Matthew chapter 11 is not that way. Matthew chapter 11 features John the Baptist. He is a prominent pre-Christmas figure in the gospel accounts. And so we hear about John the Baptist not only in this week's lesson, but in previous weeks. In this week's lesson, Jesus said that he is the one the prophets of old said would come as a messenger to prepare the way for the coming of the Christ. One of those prophets is Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 40. He said, "Behold, a voice calls out in the wilderness. Prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh shall see it." Now, last week's gospel lesson was from earlier in Matthew. It was from Matthew chapter 3. And it said that when John came preaching, saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," that he was that voice. He is the voice of Isaiah that was crying out in the wilderness. Now, what's odd about Matthew chapter 11, our gospel lesson for today, is that it's the same pre-Christmas figure, the same John the Baptist, and yet in Matthew chapter 11, he's not so sure. His mind is filled with doubts. And so, Right there at the beginning of Matthew chapter 11 and chapter 3, he sent some messengers to Jesus to ask, are you the one to come? Or shall we be looking for another? John has doubts. Doubts that are threatening to steal his Christmas. Now that reminds me of another Christmas rhyme that maybe you're familiar with. The one about how the Grinch stole Christmas. Now the Grinch is a monster of sorts who lives in the hills above Whoville where the Whos live. Who are the Whos? You may ask if you have not read. I don't know, so it's probably better left unsaid. But instead, what needs to be stated is the Grinch is a miser, and it's Christmas he hated. So while the Grinch was in Whoville, in the middle of the night, stealing Christmas, he moved around the room. He slithered and slunk with a smile most unpleasant. He took all of Christmas. He stole every present. And he grabbed the tree and he began to shove. And it was then that he heard a voice like that of a small dove. It was Cindy Lou Who. It was not more than two. She said, "Why, Santa Claus, are you stealing the Christmas tree? Why?" But the Grinch, that fake Santa Claus, lied. "Why, this tree, it has a light that is out on one side. So I'm taking it back to my workshop. I'll fix it up there. I'm taking it, my dear. I'll fix it up there and I'll bring it back here." And the fib fooled the child, and he patted her head, got her a drink of water, and sent her to bed. And up the chimney he went. With the presents in the tree, that old liar left nothing in Whoville on the walls except some books and some wire. Little Cindy Lou Who was fooled by the Christmas fib of an old liar. She was mistaken into thinking that the one who was stealing Christmas was the one who brings Christmas. And in that fictional town of Whoville, the Grinch was the one who was stealing Christmas. John the Baptist is dealing with similar things in Matthew chapter 11. Not Grinches. But he's dealing with something that is stealing his Christmas. Now, he's not young enough to be fooled by a fib, but he is thinking that maybe he has been more foolish than he thought, because he had been thinking that Jesus was going to fulfill all the messianic hopes for Christmas. That Jesus was going to fulfill every word of promise by the prophets about Christmas. Words from the prophets like Isaiah chapter 35, which said, "Behold, your God comes with the recompense of God and with vengeance, and he will come to save you." Isaiah 35, verse 10. Verse 4. Or verse 10, where the Lord says, "The ransomed of the Lord will return to Zion with singing and with everlasting joy upon their heads." These are the prophecies about the coming of Christ. The prophecies to be fulfilled at Christmas. And yet ever since John started proclaiming that Jesus was the one to fulfill all those prophetic hopes about Christmas, why? The Jewish leaders came and began interrogating him. The king, Herod, has made him into a curiosity. And he has been hated by the king's wife. And for all of those reasons, he in Matthew chapter 11 is sitting imprisoned, where he's been for quite some time and doesn't see any prospects that he'll actually be getting out. Meanwhile, Jesus is out there on the other side and knows he's in prison, but he doesn't see any recompense of God. He doesn't see vengeance. He doesn't see Jesus coming to save. And so rather than having everlasting joy upon his head, John the Baptist has over his head nothing but a cloud of deep, dampening doubt. Are you the one who is to come? Or shall we be looking for another? I suppose you know that Santa Claus isn't the one who brings Christmas. I hope you know that. But did you know that Grinch isn't the one who steals Christmas either? The one who steals Christmas is doubt. Doubt is the real stealer of Christmas. Doubt that Jesus said is planted in our hearts and minds by the one who is the father of lies. And doubt doesn't mind if we still get caught up in the hubbub and busyness of Christmas, as long as God's part in the fest we pass right by along with all the rest. As long as joy in the Lord is mixed with holiday cheer and peace on earth is just something that shepherds hear. Doubt doesn't want us to disbelieve that Jesus was actually born, and the story of the Savior can still be told on church on Sunday morning. But doubt wants to make us too cautious to actually allow our lives to be changed by that message. Doubt would rather have us believe in Jesus as a child of Bethlehem, but not believe that that is meant to make me a better man than I am. That God has a claim on my life. That he cares what I think, what I do, what I say to my wife. God wants his message of salvation at Christmas to change who we are. But doubt says be cautious. Because if you allow it to change your life, you may end up just like John the Baptist. A fool like him. And that's the kind of foolishness that John the Baptist thought he was dealing with. Because John the Baptist had let the Christmas message change his entire life. It shaped everything about who he was. John the Baptist, from the time he was a child, never touched strong drink. He never had a taste of wine. John the Baptist never lived in anything that society called normal. He didn't even live in the city. He lived out in the wilderness. He ate a wild man's food. John the Baptist started baptizing people out in the wilderness because, as he said in John chapter 1, this Jesus came to take away the sins of the world. What is that? When Jesus didn't even save those whose whole lives were shaped by their faith in him. He didn't even save John. Jesus said it in this lesson in Matthew chapter 11, that from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. Nobody knew that more than John the Baptist. He was the one who was suffering, perhaps more than any other, at the hand of those violent who take it by force. And he's sitting in prison, and it's going to get worse, because soon he's going to lose his head over it. This is chapter 11. By chapter 14, he'll have his head cut off by that same king who now has him in prison. And you know, if he had lived longer, maybe doubt would have plagued him even more. Because after John the Baptist dies, the violent will even take Jesus by force. The one that John the Baptist said was coming to save. And the violent are going to grab him by force and do worse than they did to John. They're actually going to crucify him on a cross. And doubt says that if you put your faith in him the way John did, you'll be just as much of a fool as John the Baptist was. But Jesus says something different in our gospel lesson in Matthew 11 today. Jesus says, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there is none greater than John the Baptist. And yet he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Well, why is that true? It's true because John stood up to the doubt that steals Christmas. And everyone who, even the least in the kingdom of heaven, stands up to the doubt who steals Christmas. So if John stood up to the doubt who steals Christmas, how do we steal up to the doubt who steals Christmas? What did John do? Jesus gave him the how. It's in this lesson. Jesus sent those messengers back to John to say to him in verse 4, go and tell John what you've heard and seen. And then in verse 6, and blessed is the one who's not offended by me. Go and tell. Go and tell John what you've heard and seen. He needs to hear that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament hopes about the coming of the Christ. So Jesus told him specifically what to tell. Tell him that the blind receive their sight, that the lame walk, that lepers are cleansed, that the deaf hear, that the poor have good news preached to them, and the dead are raised. Blessed is the one who is not offended on account of me. He needs to hear. John can't see all of these things going on from inside his prison walls. But hearing the message, the good news that Jesus fulfills the messianic hopes for the coming of the Christ, well, it's enough to bolster faith and dispel the doubt that is in John's heart and mind. Because that's what Isaiah had said. Isaiah chapter 35, verse 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame man will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. John needs to hear the news of the gospel. Because faith comes through hearing, and hearing comes through the message of Christ. That's what the Bible says in Romans chapter 10, verse 17. Faith comes through hearing, and hearing comes through the word of Christ. So how do we dispel the doubts? Hearing the good news. We, like John, need to hear it again. The good news of Jesus Christ that these kids are sharing with us today. That he was born as a Savior in Bethlehem. We need to hear that good news. It's the hearing that changed the heart of the Grinch, too, if you know the end of this story. That next morning, he was expecting to hear the sounds from Whoville. And when he heard the sound coming through the ice and the snow, he knew it would be sad. Because on Christmas morning they awoke and there was no Christmas to be had. Except he heard the sound and it was not sad but merry. It couldn't be. But it was merry, very. And the Grinch began to think thoughts he never thought before. Maybe Christmas, he thought, doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas, he thought to himself, means a little bit more. Well, Christmas doesn't come from a store. And it does mean more. Christmas means that our God has come. He has come to save us. And he did it by bringing the forgiveness of sins that John the Baptist preached about. And it happened through his death on a cross. It means that God has a claim on our life. And our life is not just about our wants and our cares, but it's about God's plan for who we are and how we participate in his plan of salvation. What is our role? For John the Baptist, that role was very specific. That role meant that he would be the Elijah who is to come. That's what Jesus says in John chapter 11. He says, if you are willing to accept it, verse 14, he is the Elijah who is to come. That is the Elijah who the prophets spoke of. Which means, back in verses 7 through 9, that John would not live in king's houses wearing soft clothes. John was destined to live in the wilderness. John would not have many of the comforts of society that we know of, but he would live the eccentric life of a prophet. What about you and me? Don't let Christmas go by this year without asking that question about what it means for you. What role does God have for me to play in his story of salvation? How are you speaking his word? These children sharing it with us in the Christmas story. But how does he want you to share it? With your family, with your children, with your grandchildren, with your co-workers? God says, be cautious. Don't let it change your life. But if the message of Jesus is truly the story of Christmas, then don't let doubt steal your Christmas this year. Instead, Jesus said, at the end of our lesson, he who has ears, let him hear. Because it's the hearing of the good news of Jesus that dispels the doubt that would steal our Christmas. In Jesus' name.